Live from the studio, I'm Jimmy Selesky. Now, just this week, we Americans celebrated Juneteenth. Now, Juneteenth has been officially a federal holiday since just 2021. This is only the fourth year in a row that we have recognized June 19th as an official federal holiday. It was signed into law by Uncle Joe Biden himself in 2021. Now, Juneteenth commemorates June 19th, 1865, which is the day when the final slaves in the Confederacy were freed. This occurred in Texas. Now, Texas was the most remote state in the Confederacy. If you're thinking of the 1865 map at the time, there's a lot of territories, there's way less states, there's way less people in general. Texas is relatively out there. And while most of the battling and conflict and warring was occurring in places like my home state of Maryland, Virginia, Atlanta, Pennsylvania, places all in that region, the remote areas of the Confederacy and the Union in the North were relatively unaffected. Obviously economically and socially they were affected, but in terms of just your everyday, day-to-day, there weren't musket bullets getting shot through your window if you were living in Boston, necessarily, in the Civil War. Likewise, if you were living in Texas. So a lot of the people that lived in the parts of the country that were under constant attack and battles occurring in their backyards and things like that, it's kind of nuts to think about. A lot of them just kind of packed up and moved out west to places like Texas, including slave owners who took their slaves with them, and they operated their lives, business as usual, in a new place. And so, likewise, in the same way that the battling did not affect the people of Texas as much as it affected the people in Virginia and Maryland and so forth, neither did the laws or the results of the war. The Army of the Trans-Mississippi was the last faction of the Confederacy to actually surrender. And that happened almost 2 months after Robert E. Lee, the commanding general of the Confederate Army, officially surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant, the commanding general of the Union, on April 9th, 1865. That happened in a place called Appomattox Courthouse, which is actually the name of a community. It's not an actual courthouse. It is now, but the courthouse was erected in 1892, almost 30 years later. The community is called Appomattox Courthouse. And fun fact, there's a guy named Wilmer McLean, an American grocer, according to Wikipedia. I'm assuming that means you own a grocery store. It's spelled Grocer. And Wilmer McLean was living in a town called Manassas, Virginia in 1861, where his property was involved in the first Battle of Bull Run, which is officially the first major battle of the Civil War. So that took place in part in his yard. He later moved his family to the community of Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, where in 1865, when Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant were searching for a place to meet to commence the official surrender and end of the Civil War, they asked Mr. McLean if they could use his house as the meeting spot. And so Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant go into this dude's house and sign the official surrendering documentation, wherever that entails. So Wilmer McLean is coined as saying that, quote, the war began in my front yard and ended in my front parlor. Now, unfortunately, people in 1865 did not have bars, because I would have said the Civil War began and ended in my backyard. That sounds hard as hell. They always kind of just put a little too much seasoning on their terms. Not even like the right seasoning, like ginger and coriander, like the wrong seasoning. Just put some pepper on that bitch. Began and ended in my backyard. Whatever. But that's an interesting fact. Now, the Army of the Trans-Mississippi, oddly enough, counterintuitively, did not really include the state of Mississippi, because the Army of the Trans-Mississippi actually primarily comprised the 3 Confederate states west of the Mississippi River. The state of Mississippi is actually east of the Mississippi. The Mississippi River makes its western border. And again, they didn't surrender until almost 2 months later on June 2nd, 1865. Remember, the official surrender occurred on April 9th, 1865. Now, this, of course, is several months. Both dates are several months after the Emancipation Proclamation took effect on the first day of the year in 1865, January 1st. That's the first day, by the way. That, of course, is when Abraham Lincoln made it official that all slaves in the Confederacy are officially freed. Now, again, this news, shall we say news, perhaps the news reached the entirety of the Confederate States, but the effect of the news did not. There's really no way for me to know at this moment if either of those things are true, but at the very least, we know that they weren't paying attention in Texas. That was some East Coast shit. So people were still living lives as usual. Slaves were still slaves. Several months after the Emancipation Proclamation and a couple months after the Civil War was over. It wasn't until 17 days after the surrender of the Trans-Mississippi Army, a couple months after the surrender of the Confederate Army, and more than 5 months after the Emancipation Proclamation took effect, that the last slaves in America, in Texas, were finally freed. And that was done by a man by the name of Gordon Granger, a Union Major General, who voyaged to Texas, Galveston, the island of Galveston, to officially enforce the laws of the Union and nullify any state laws made in Texas during wartime. And he did so by issuing a general order, the most famous of which being General Order Number 3. It is debated whether he announced this out loud in a big presentation. People say this occurred at Ashton Villa, but apparently there's no evidence historically to support that. But regardless, the order itself read as follows, quote, "The people of Texas are informed that in accordance with a proclamation from the executive of the United States," that being the Emancipation Proclamation, "all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between employer and hired labor. The freedmen are advised to remain quietly at their present homes and work for wages. They are informed that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts and that they will not be supported in idleness, either there or elsewhere." So basically, in today's terms, he's saying, all slaves are free, but guys, just chill where you're at right now. Don't leave the plantation. Just stay there. You can still work for your former master, but he's got to pay you now. So let's talk wages here. And also, don't think you can just leave the plantation and just hang around at a military post or on the streets and shit, because we're not gonna help you out and give you money and shit. Just, you're not a slave anymore. You're a farmhand. So figure it out. And hey, I mean, in the heat of the moment, not so bad, actually. Obviously that led to 100 more years plus of trying to figure out how to deal with the aftermath. But in the moment, pretty solid. Now, going back to the holiday itself, Juneteenth. I like Juneteenth, actually. I like the idea of Juneteenth, let's say. I believe it should be a federal holiday. I see no reason why it shouldn't. It commemorates a landmark date in the history of this country, a huge landmark date in the history of this country. It has been celebrated as a holiday in many states, primarily, most notably in Texas itself, where people celebrate this day and have been, and now it is officially recognized by the federal government. I like that. And now I'm starting to notice that people are starting to get off of work for it. The guy in my band, Joe, was off of work yesterday. We were able to work on stuff for Juneteenth, which was nice. Now, he works at Morgan State University, which is a HBCU, historically black college university. I guess it's both. So obviously they were off yesterday, which is good. Good for them. I don't think everybody is off on Juneteenth, but I see no reason why not. I really don't. I didn't take a day off because I don't take fucking days off, but that's just me. You don't have to be like me. Anyway, I like the idea of Juneteenth, but there's something that I feel the need to discuss as it pertains to this holiday. Unfortunately, as much as I would love to be for Juneteenth to be celebrated as a holiday by not just Black Americans, but all Americans, and I would like it to be a unifying holiday, unfortunately, there is a massive vibe that is understandable. I'm not saying I don't get it or why it exists, but unfortunately, there seems to be a very strong, almost prominent, predominant sentiment surrounding this holiday that it is not simply pro-Black, but it is, on many levels, kind of a fuck you to white America. Now, I know that sounds dramatic, but there's a couple posts that I came across, and it's not like this widespread thing that's like in your face, but it's kind of just a reinforcement of what we kind of already see on a day-to-day basis. This is I don't know who the girl who shared the original post is, Jessica Davis. It's got 54,000 likes. It's a popular post. And it appears to be like a painting of, if anybody remembers that viral video from, I want to say like within the past year, I feel like maybe, there was like a big fight down south. I mean, I'm looking at this like one of those like paddle ships or whatever. So this looks like it's actually like in Mississippi, Louisiana, something like that, down south on the Mississippi River. And a bunch of white guys on a boat got in a fight with some Black guy on the dock, and then a bunch of random other Black people ran over to defend the Black guy, and it became kind of like this racial brawl. It was just white people versus Black people, and that's what you see painted here. And the caption of this photo is, "Happy Juneteenth. Happy Juneteenth." And that really kind of put me where I needed to be to do this episode in general. Because as much as I like the idea of Juneteenth, there is an undeniable element of this holiday that is not simply celebrating the end of slavery, celebrating Black culture, but rather it is simultaneously, in large part, a recognition of how much America sucks. And also, as demonstrated in this picture, basically symbolizing Juneteenth in the form of a white versus Black racial brawl. That was a viral video. It's like, if we're going to observe Juneteenth from the angle of this is a national fuck white people day, ha ha, we're free, nothing you can do about it, then I'm not really in support of that. I don't think that is a good sentiment to have. I understand why it exists, but a federal holiday should be a unifying holiday. It should not be something where a major demographic in the country for a day is just basically saying, yeah, fuck you guys, right? We're free now, bitch. Nah, 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 nah. Like, that's not a good sentiment, and it's hard to expect white people to really get behind this day if it's going to be all about how much we suck. You know? That's not like my ideal version of a holiday. It's just shitting on myself. Like, that's not really a holiday. That's every other day. A holiday, I would prefer that I'm stoked to be me, and I'm stoked to be part of this country. And now it seems like inadvertently we've taken a holiday that should be that. Again, a celebration of a major advancement in our civilization for all people, and turn it into a yet another day to remember and talk about and dredge up the horrible aspects of our past, not in a good, forward-thinking, optimistic way, but rather in a dwelling, resentful way. That's not good. That's not good. And it's hard to deny that that is not, if not the majority sentiment of this day for many people, at the very least, a very significant portion of the sentiment. And I think that needs to go away in order for all Americans to get behind this holiday. And I don't think it's as difficult to make that go away as people think. I think the reason why we have this sentiment is obviously a much larger conversation, which, I have the rest of my life on this channel to discuss, so I'm not going to attempt to pack it all into one episode. And it's certainly not the first time we've discussed this, but the way that we look at each other in this country from a racial perspective and the way that we see this history is not entirely honest. It's simply not. The reality is that if we chose to, the Civil War could be a point in history that we could look at hundreds of thousands of Americans dying. And primarily white Americans. Black Americans fought in the Civil War, they did, but the vast majority of men who fought and died, and not just men who fought and died, but women and children. Most of the deaths in the Civil War were not even combat involved. They were diseases and other things like that. So most of the people that died in the Civil War weren't shot in the head by a bullet. They died of some disease or malnutrition or something like that. That was most people. You didn't even have to be a soldier to be involved in the dying during the Civil War. This was the largest death toll of Americans in history. More than World War II, more than World War I, more than the Revolutionary War, more than any other period in history. More Americans died during the Civil War than any other point in American history, and the vast majority of those people were white Americans. And the vast majority of those white Americans who died were fighting for the Union. More people died in the Union than the Confederacy. Now, the Union also had way more soldiers. They had way more resources. So a smaller percentage of the Union died than the Confederacy. The Confederacy, they had way less people to pick from. They were reaching for older men and young boys towards the end just to fill their ranks. And again, with the limited resources, most of their soldiers weren't even dying in combat. They were dying of malnutrition and hypothermia and diseases, gangrene, infection, and dysentery, and all kinds of things like that. Such a massive, I don't want to put an exact number on because I don't know, but a massive percentage of soldiers who fought for the Confederacy died, as compared to a lower percentage of soldiers who fought in the Union. But on a raw numbers basis, more Northerners died than Southerners in the Civil War. The Northerners being the ones that were ostensibly fighting for the end of slavery, the abolition of slavery. Hundreds of thousands of Americans, white Americans, including black Americans, that's a given. There were absolutely Union soldiers fighting that were freed slaves or just free black Americans in general. And there were black Americans that fought on the Confederate side in exchange for the freedom as well. So there were black Americans involved in the Civil War, but just as a raw population basis, we're talking, again, the vast majority being white Americans who fought and died for the end of slavery. And again, look, this is another misconception about the Civil War in general, going beyond this, which is that the average soldier in either army had a strong feeling about slavery, and that's what drove them to fight and sacrifice their lives and livelihood. That is such a misconception of history. I'm not going to get into the Civil War wasn't about slavery argument. It was about states' rights. It's like, yeah, it was about states' rights in regard, but the catalyst was slavery. And that was, but the main takeaway, aside from that, classic trope of an argument, is that regardless of what the main purpose of the war itself was between the two factions, the average soldier, much like in every war that's ever existed, really had no stake in the game, or not nearly as much of a stake in the game as the people who were orchestrating the conflict. There's a stat that gets pitched around all the time on Twitter and stuff like that, where they say like less than 2%, it was like 1.5, 1.6, something like that percent of Americans in 1860 owned slaves. And that is slightly misleading of a statistic, because they basically just take the amount of people who legally own slaves, and then they just divide it by the amount of free people in America. So they go, okay, so there's 27 million free people in America in 1860, let's say, and like 400,000 of them own slaves. So less than 2% of people in America own slaves. And it's like, again, it's misleading. A more accurate number is about 7.6% because it goes for families. Because, okay, if you're the head of the household, you own slaves, but also your wife and children are all involved in that, like in kind of an ownership of slaves. So if you go by families, it's more like there were 5 million, 6 million families in 1860 households, and about 400,000 of them own slaves. So it's closer to 8%, which is still a low number. It's about 1 in 13 families in America. Obviously higher than 1 in 50 or 1 in 100, but still obviously a relatively small portion of Americans actually owned slaves. And there's other things there too. People say, well, you should exclude the North because it wasn't really a thing up there. So if you just dwindle it down to the southern states that actually use slavery and then incorporate it as a percentage of that, the number gets much higher. So, okay, great. But I don't know if that's necessarily a fair thing, because it's like, okay, obviously we can say that the South was heavily involved with slavery, but America as a whole, which comprises all of the parts of America, it's like America as a country is what we hold up to the chopping block, not just specifically the South. When we're judging the history of this country, we're talking about the entirety of the country. And obviously we know that there wasn't just something in the water that made Northerners better people. They just didn't really have a use for manual slave labor, and therefore they didn't use it. It wasn't an agricultural society up there. They were more industry involved. And so slavery wasn't not a thing in the North because they were better moral people. It just wasn't a thing up there because they didn't have a use for it. Regardless, the idea being that no matter how you slice the numbers, the amount of people that actually owned slaves, and there's all kinds of ways to look at it in addition to that, even, because it was obviously very common at the time for other farmers to rent slaves for the day or for a week, and they'd pay the owner of the slave to use the slave. So they were benefiting from slave labor. Oddly enough, they are kind of paying a wage at that point. They're just paying the wage to the slave owner instead of the slave. So I don't even know if it's like, I feel like that's still kind of on the owner, because the person who's renting the slave is still paying a wage. It's just not getting to the person who's doing the work. So I don't know if that really should count as another person. I mean, obviously they are participating in slave labor, but they're not necessarily benefiting from it any more than they would by using paid labor, because they are paying for the labor. So, I mean, again, there's all kinds of ways to look at it. The point is that at the end of the day, the majority of people, especially the people that were fighting in these wars, because, okay, 1 in 13 families in the United States in 1860 actually owned slaves. And obviously those were the rich, wealthy families. That was the upper class of the country. Those are not really going to be the same families who are sending their kids off to go die in a snowstorm in the woods to fight the Union and blow up train tracks and get their head blown off with a musket or their leg cut off because they got a cut. That's not what, like, the people that were actually fighting in these wars were poor people who were farmhands on their own farms, picking their own cotton, everything like that, growing their own tobacco, just regular, poor, dirt poor people who were fighting not because they were willing to die for the right of some other rich person to own slaves, or willing to die so that some other rich person couldn't own slaves in the context of the North. They were fighting because that's what they were doing. If you're a kid from some small random town in Alabama and every kid from your school, high school, and church is all conscripting to the military to fight for Alabama and your hometown and everything like that, you're going to join them. That's what you're doing. And you're not doing it because, man, I'd rather die than see old man Johnson down the street on his plantation not be able to have slaves. Clearly, that's not what drives people to fight and die. Clearly, it's something different. So to act like hundreds of thousands of people in the South risked their lives to preserve slavery specifically is, again, a very misguided and silly way to look at history. The people who made the decision to secede the states and send their people to war, those people did so to preserve slavery. But again, they weren't the ones fighting. They were the ones starting the fight and then sending poor people who didn't have slaves to go die for it. So to hold all those Confederate soldiers as evil people is, in my opinion, just I don't know. It's not. It's unbecoming. It's unbecoming. And again, same goes for the North. They fought because they were soldiers. They fought because people from their towns were joining the military, or maybe there was a draft. I don't even know. I didn't look into it that far. But certainly the majority of white people in any part of the country in 1860 were not vehement abolitionist, radical, fucking no human. That's not the average white person in any part of the country in 1860. They weren't willing to die to free slaves 1,000 miles away in the South. That's not what it was about from the soldier's perspective. So I say all that to paint the picture that hundreds of thousands of people died either fighting for a cause that was loosely connected to slavery, but not in the context of their reasoning for fighting in the perspective of the Confederates, and on the Union side, fighting on behalf of a cause to end slavery. And it was because of this war and the hundreds of thousands of people that died in the fighting of it that slavery was ended. And so this should be a celebration not of black people alone in America gaining their freedom, but as America itself dealing with the problem of slavery at the cost of hundreds of thousands, if not close to 1 million people by some estimates. Black Americans themselves did not even have the institutional power or the organization or anything at that time to single-handedly end slavery for themselves. They didn't. It ended because a significant enough portion of white people in this country believed in abolishing it. That's just a fact. You can go, and I'm not saying that black Americans didn't fight and die for this cause as well. I'm just saying that it could not have been done by them alone. So some credit must be given to the white Americans who died for this cause as well. And you don't really see that sentiment talked about very much in the celebration of this holiday, Juneteenth. You know, even in states like South Carolina, where more than half of the population was slaves. At the height of slavery in South Carolina, something like 57% of the state's population were slaves. So there were literally more slaves than non-slaves in South Carolina on the brink of the Civil War. And even in states like that, there was no organized rebellion. There was no slaves getting together. I mean, there were offshoots here and something popped off there every now and then. But as far as like people getting together and be like, hey, did you ever notice that there's more of us than them? And obviously, you know, there's a whole lot of things that come into play. And I'm not saying that it could have gone any other way. I'm just noting that even in states where they had the majority of people, there was no abolition of slavery without the help of every other person in America. So when you're discussing credit for the ending of this dark time in our history, it should be a thing that we can all celebrate together because we all fought for it and made it a thing together. If you're honest about the realities of slavery and you go back in time even before it was brought to America, slavery has always been a thing. America didn't invent it. We participated in it. We didn't go to Africa and enslave people. We went to Africa and purchased enslaved people from the African people who were capturing and conquering and enslaving each other as their primary export. And yes, our patronage of that export, our market was wide, and so it drove up the amount of people getting enslaved in Africa because it was a major industry for them. So indirectly, we led to the enslavement, but it wasn't like we had to go over there and do it ourselves. We just pulled up to the shore and put them on the boat. It was a transaction. So clearly, it wasn't the West or the Americans that invented it. In fact, there's more slaves in the world today than there have ever been in the history of the world, including the height of the transatlantic slave trade in America and the Americas. So we have to incorporate all of that when we're discussing the true history and context of slavery. The fact of the matter is that America and the West, Western civilization as a whole, did not start slavery. We ended it. We ended it. And that is due in large part not just to the enslaved people who gained their freedom, but the people of this civilization who came to a point of awakening, of moral responsibility, that even though they benefited from this system, which they easily could have kept in place, if they wanted to, they chose not to. A decision that many other civilizations to this day have not made. They benefit from slavery and they're able to continue the system, and therefore they have not ended it. The West said, we could maintain it if we wanted to, but we're not going to fucking do it. We're ending this. This is wrong. And millions of people fought and died to see that happen, whether directly or indirectly. All of us, Black Americans, white Americans, and everyone in between fought and died for the advancement of where we are today. And so I venture to say that if you look at Juneteenth as a fuck you to white people holiday, that's the reason why more white people aren't taking off of work and grilling and cooking out. Because personally, as a white person, I'm not very interested in celebrating a day where I'm supposed to think about how much I suck. Especially being that my family was in fucking Europe for 100 more years after the fact. It had nothing to do with it regardless. But anyway, it's not exactly on the top of my to-do list to go eat a bunch of glizzies in celebration of a middle finger to me. However, if we could get to the place in this country where we could look at Juneteenth as a holiday it should be, a celebration of the progress that has been made in this country, fought for by the blood, sweat, and tears of all of us. That should be a unifying thing. And if we can get to that point, then happy fucking Juneteenth to all, and to all a good night. My name is Jimmy Selesky. This has been live from the studio. Leave us a like, subscribe, tell us what you think in the comments. Till next time, peace.